Picture this. You're standing at the edge of an ancient swampland where the air hangs thick with moisture and the ground squelches beneath your feet. The year is 60 million years ago, and this isn't the world you know. This is a planet where giants ruled the waters and early human ancestors faced threats that would make your worst nightmares seem like bedtime stories. Welcome back to the 4th chapter of our epic prehistoric saga. If you thought the previous battles were intense, you haven't seen anything yet. Today, we're diving deeper into one of the most brutal survival stories ever told, where primitive humans didn't just fight for territory or resources. They fought for the very right to exist on a planet that seemed determined to wipe them out. But before we plunge into the chaos, let me paint you a picture of just how insane this prehistoric world really was. We're talking about an era where snakes grew to lengths that would span multiple city blocks, where the very ground you walked on could suddenly come alive and swallow you whole, and where every step through the swamp meant dancing with death itself. Now, you might be thinking, this is just another nature documentary about some big, scary animals. Wrong. This is the untold story of how our earliest ancestors not only survived, but actually declared war on the most terrifying predator that ever slithered across the earth. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why this battle changed the course of evolution forever. Here's what most people don't realize about prehistoric times. We always imagine early humans cowering in caves, barely scraping by, running from every threat. But archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. These weren't helpless primitives. These were strategic warriors who looked at a 40-foot killing machine and said, "Not today." The Titanoboa wasn't just big. It was a living nightmare wrapped in scales and muscle. Imagine a creature so massive that it could crush a car without even trying. Now imagine dozens of them, ruling the ancient swamplands like underwater kings. These beasts didn't just hunt for food. They hunted for dominance, and anything that entered their territory became fair game. But here's where it gets crazy. Archaeological sites across South America have revealed something that completely changed how we understand early human behavior. We found evidence of organized hunting parties, sophisticated traps, and what can only be described as military tactics being used against these giant serpents. This wasn't random survival. This was warfare. The Swamp War didn't start overnight. It began with a single incident that would spark generations of conflict between two species fighting for control of the same territory. Picture the scene. A small tribe of early humans had established a settlement near what they thought was a safe water source. They had no idea they had just built their homes directly in the hunting grounds of the most dangerous predator on the planet. It was during the wet season when the first attack happened. The water levels had risen, flooding the usual pathways and forcing both humans and Titanoboas into closer contact than ever before. What started as a chance encounter quickly escalated into something much more sinister. The lead scout of the human tribe was gathering water at dawn when the surface of the swamp began to ripple in ways that defied explanation. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the usual morning disturbance from smaller creatures. But then the ripples grew larger, more purposeful, and suddenly the water itself seemed to come alive. What emerged from that murky water would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. A head the size of a grown human, followed by coils that seemed to go on forever. The Titanoboa had been watching, waiting, studying these strange new creatures that had invaded its domain. And now it was time to send a message. The attack was swift and brutal. Before the scout could even scream, 40 feet of pure muscle had wrapped around him, crushing bones that had taken decades to grow strong. But here's what makes this story different from every other predator encounter in history. The other humans didn't run. They didn't scatter to the winds like every instinct told them to do. Instead, they did something that would define human nature for millions of years to come. They got angry. Within hours of the first attack, something unprecedented happened. The entire tribe gathered for what anthropologists now believe was the first organized war council in human history. They weren't just planning to avoid the snake. They were planning to hunt it down and make it pay for what it had done. Now you have to understand the sheer insanity of what these early humans were proposing. They were talking about hunting a creature that was literally built to kill anything that crossed its path. A predator so perfectly designed that it had no natural enemies, no weaknesses, and absolutely no fear of these small, relatively fragile primates. But our ancestors had something that the Titanoboa didn't. They had each other, and more importantly, they had the one weapon that would eventually make them the dominant species on the planet. They could think, plan, and adapt faster than any creature that had ever lived. The first hunting party consisted of 12 individuals, each armed with the most advanced weapons their technology could provide. We're talking sharpened stones, hardened wooden spears, and most importantly, a level of coordination that the animal kingdom had never seen before. They weren't just hunters, they were the world's first military unit. The plan was deceptively simple. Track the beast to its lair, surround it while it was sleeping, and strike with everything they had before it could react. What they didn't account for was just how intelligent their enemy really was. The Titanoboa had been hunting for millions of years, and it had learned to recognize threats long before they became dangerous. As the hunting party made their way deeper into the swamp, they had no idea they were walking directly into a trap. The giant serpent had been tracking them since they left their settlement, using senses that humans couldn't even comprehend. It could feel their footsteps through the ground, smell their fear in the air, and detect the heat of their bodies from hundreds of yards away. The first sign that something was wrong came when the usual sounds of the swamp suddenly stopped. No birds, no insects, no splashing from smaller animals. Just an eerie silence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. The experienced hunters among them recognized this as a warning sign, but by then it was already too late. The attack came from below. While the humans had been scanning the trees and water surface for signs of their prey, the Titanoboa had been moving through underwater channels, positioning itself directly beneath their path. When it finally struck, it did so with a precision that would have impressed modern military strategists. 3 hunters were taken in the first few seconds, their screams cut short as massive coils wrapped around them with bone-crushing force. The remaining 9 faced a choice that would define the entire future of human evolution. They could run, abandoning their fallen comrades and admitting defeat to a creature that now knew exactly where their settlement was located. Or they could stand their ground and fight a battle that logic said they couldn't win. What happened next would be talked about around campfires for generations. Instead of fleeing, the surviving hunters did something that the Titanoboa had never experienced in its millions of years of evolution. They fought back as a unit, coordinating their attacks in ways that confused and frustrated the massive predator. While some hunters distracted the beast with spear thrusts and loud noises, others worked to free their captured comrades. It was a desperate gamble that relied on split-second timing and absolute trust in each other. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and they would all become the serpent's next meal. The battle lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it was over, both sides had learned something crucial about their enemy. The humans discovered that the Titanoboa, despite its incredible size and strength, was not invincible. It could be hurt, confused, and even forced to retreat if faced with coordinated resistance. The Titanoboa, on the other hand, learned something far more disturbing. These small creatures weren't just another food source. They were something new, something that fought with intelligence rather than instinct. And for the first time in its long life, the giant serpent felt something it had never experienced before. It felt threatened. The retreat wasn't a victory. It was a declaration of war. Word of the encounter spread through the human settlement like wildfire, but instead of fear, something else began to take hold. These early humans possessed something that would become their greatest evolutionary advantage. They could learn from failure, adapt their strategies, and turn defeat into motivation. Within days, the entire dynamic of the settlement had changed. Children who had been playing with sticks were now being trained to recognize snake movement patterns. Adults who had focused on gathering food were suddenly crafting weapons with deadly precision. The elderly, those with the most knowledge of the swamp's secrets, became military advisors planning campaigns that would have impressed generals thousands of years in the future. But the Titanoboa wasn't sitting idle either. These massive serpents possessed an intelligence that modern science is only beginning to understand. They could remember threats, communicate with others of their species, and most terrifyingly, they could hold grudges. The encounter with the human hunting party had triggered something primal in the giant snake's brain. These small creatures had dared to wound it, to make it bleed, to force it to retreat. That was unacceptable. What followed was an escalation that neither species had anticipated. The Titanoboa began actively hunting humans, abandoning its usual ambush tactics for something far more aggressive. It started tracking the settlement, learning the humans' daily routines, studying their weaknesses. This wasn't random predation anymore. This was targeted elimination. The humans, meanwhile, were developing technologies that wouldn't be seen again for millions of years. They created the first composite weapons, binding sharp stones to wooden handles with plant fibers to create spears that could penetrate even the thickest scales. They developed communication systems using drums and calls that could coordinate attacks across vast distances. Most importantly, they began to understand their enemy in ways that pure instinct never could have achieved. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals something extraordinary. Tool-making sites show a sudden jump in sophistication that scientists call the Titanoboa innovation. Weapons became deadlier, traps became more complex, and defensive structures appeared almost overnight. It was as if the threat of these giant serpents had accelerated human evolution by millions of years. The second major battle occurred during what researchers now call the Night of Coils. The Titanoboa had learned from its previous encounter and decided to take the fight directly to the human settlement. Under cover of darkness, not one but three of these massive serpents began a coordinated assault on the human camp. The attack began with psychological warfare. The snakes didn't strike immediately. Instead, they surrounded the settlement and began making sounds that humans had never heard before, low, rumbling vibrations that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was a form of communication between the serpents, but to the humans, it sounded like the very ground was preparing to swallow them alive. Children began crying. Adults grabbed whatever weapons they could find, but the most experienced warriors recognized this for what it was. The enemy was trying to break their morale before the real attack began. These early humans had learned to read their opponents as well as any modern military strategist. The response was immediate and coordinated. Fire torches were lit in specific patterns around the settlement's perimeter, not just for light, but as a communication system that told every defender exactly where the threats were positioned. Guard rotations that had been practiced for weeks suddenly activated, with fighters moving to predetermined positions without needing verbal commands. When the first Titanoboa finally struck, it found something it hadn't expected. Instead of panicked prey, it encountered organized resistance. The humans had learned to fight as a single organism, each individual playing a crucial role in a larger strategy. Spear throwers provided covering fire while shield bearers created protective barriers. Scouts relayed information about snake positions while trap specialists activated devices that had been prepared for exactly this scenario. The battle was unlike anything the prehistoric world had ever seen. On one side, 40-foot serpents with enough strength to crush boulders and speed that defied their massive size. On the other, small primates armed with primitive weapons but fighting with intelligence, coordination, and something the snakes couldn't understand. They were fighting for more than survival. They were fighting for the right to exist in a world that seemed designed to destroy them. The turning point came when the humans implemented what military historians now recognize as the first recorded use of combined arms tactics. While one group of fighters engaged the lead Titanoboa in direct combat, another team used the distraction to target the serpent's most vulnerable areas. They had learned from previous encounters that these giants, despite their incredible strength, had weak points that could be exploited by determined attackers. The strategy worked better than anyone had dared hope. The lead serpent, wounded and confused by attacks coming from multiple directions, began to retreat toward the water. But the humans had anticipated this. They had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment, creating barriers and traps that would prevent the snakes from reaching their aquatic sanctuary. What followed was a chase that would become legend among early human tribes. The wounded Titanoboa, desperate to escape, began thrashing through the swampland with 36 humans in pursuit. But this wasn't a chaotic mob chasing a wounded animal. This was a coordinated hunting party executing a plan that had been refined through multiple encounters with their giant enemies. Different groups of hunters took turns maintaining pressure on the fleeing serpent, ensuring that it never had time to rest or recover from its wounds. Scout teams moved ahead to set up ambush points while others followed directly behind to prevent the snake from doubling back toward the settlement. It was a level of tactical sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until humans developed formal military organizations thousands of years later. The chase lasted for 3 days and covered nearly 50 miles of treacherous swampland. Both sides pushed themselves to the absolute limits of endurance. The Titanoboa, despite its wounds, remained incredibly dangerous. Several times during the pursuit, it managed to turn the tables on its pursuers, forcing them to retreat and regroup before resuming the hunt. But the humans had one crucial advantage. They could take shifts. While some rested, others continued the pursuit. The serpent, massive and powerful as it was, eventually began to slow. Its wounds, while not fatal, were taking their toll. More importantly, it was being pushed further and further from its familiar territory into areas where it had no geographical advantages. The final confrontation took place in what is now known as the Bone Valley, though back then it was simply a narrow canyon that offered no escape routes. The Titanoboa, finally cornered and unable to retreat further, turned to face its tormentors one last time. What happened next would be remembered as the moment when humans truly announced their presence as the planet's new dominant species. The battle itself was brutal and decisive. 40-foot coils of muscle and scale against 24 humans armed with stone-tipped spears and unbreakable determination. The outcome was never really in doubt, not because the humans were stronger or faster, but because they had learned to fight as something greater than the sum of their individual parts. When it was over, the surviving members of the hunting party faced a choice that would define human nature for millions of years to come. They could celebrate their victory and return home as heroes, or they could send a message that would be understood by every Titanoboa in the swampland. They chose the message. What they did next would echo through evolutionary history, like thunder through a canyon. Instead of simply returning home with proof of their victory, these early humans made a decision that revealed something profound about their species. They understood the power of reputation, the importance of sending a signal that would travel far beyond this single encounter. The hunters carefully positioned the massive serpent's remains in the most visible location they could find, not hidden away like a shameful secret, but displayed prominently where any other Titanoboa venturing into the area would immediately understand what had happened here. This wasn't just about one dead snake. This was about establishing dominance in a world where strength meant survival. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The death of this particular Titanoboa didn't end the conflict. It escalated it beyond anything either species had imagined possible. You see, these giant serpents weren't solitary creatures like most modern snakes. Archaeological evidence suggests they had complex social structures, communication networks, and most dangerously, collective memory. When the news of their fallen comrade spread through the serpent community, something unprecedented happened in the animal kingdom. The Titanoboas began coordinating their efforts in ways that defied everything scientists thought they knew about reptilian intelligence. What had started as territorial disputes between individual predators and human settlements suddenly became something much larger. It became a species war. The response came within weeks. Scouts from the human settlement began reporting strange movements throughout the swampland. Multiple Titanoboas were being seen together, something that had never been documented before. These solitary hunters were abandoning millions of years of evolutionary behavior to form what could only be described as military units. The implications were terrifying. A single Titanoboa was a challenge that required the entire fighting strength of a human settlement. Multiple serpents working together represented an existential threat that could wipe out entire populations in a matter of hours. The humans faced a choice that would define their species forever: adapt or become extinct. What happened next was nothing short of revolutionary. Human settlements across the region began communicating with each other for the first time in recorded history. Not just casual contact between neighboring tribes, but organized information sharing about enemy movements, tactical innovations, and resource allocation. The threat of the Titanoboa alliance had forced humanity to take its first steps toward civilization. The transformation was remarkable. Within months, scattered groups of early humans had formed the world's first military alliance. Runners carried messages between settlements, coordinating defensive strategies across hundreds of miles. Weaponsmiths shared their innovations, creating standardized equipment that could be used by fighters from different tribes. Most importantly, they began training together, developing combat techniques that maximized their collective strengths. The Titanoboas, meanwhile, were implementing their own evolutionary leap. These ancient predators began displaying behaviors that challenged every assumption about reptilian cognition. They started using tools, manipulating their environment to create advantages during hunts. Fallen trees were positioned to block human escape routes. Water channels were redirected to flood human camps. Rock formations were deliberately collapsed to create barriers that separated human fighters from their support networks. Archaeological sites from this period reveal evidence of engineering projects that seem impossible for creatures without opposable thumbs. Yet somehow, these massive serpents were reshaping entire landscapes to support their war effort. The intelligence required for such coordinated construction projects suggested that humanity was facing an enemy far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The first major engagement of this escalated conflict occurred at what historians now call the Battle of Three Rivers. A massive human settlement had been established at the confluence of three waterways, chosen specifically because it offered multiple escape routes and defensive advantages. The location seemed perfect for human habitation, with high ground for observation posts and natural barriers that would funnel attacking predators into predetermined kill zones. The Titanoboas had other plans. Instead of launching a direct assault on the fortified settlement, they implemented a strategy that demonstrated tactical thinking on par with the most brilliant human commanders. They began systematically cutting off the settlement's access to fresh water by blocking the three rivers at strategic points upstream. The siege that followed lasted for over 2 months. As water supplies dwindled, the human defenders faced an impossible choice. They could abandon their carefully prepared positions and venture into the swampland to find alternative water sources, where they would be vulnerable to serpent ambushes. Or they could remain at their fortifications and slowly die of thirst while their enemies waited patiently outside. But the humans had been preparing for exactly this type of warfare. During the weeks of alliance building, they had developed contingency plans for scenarios that seemed like paranoid fantasies at the time. Emergency supply caches had been established throughout the region, hidden in locations that only human scouts could access. Communication networks allowed besieged settlements to request assistance from allies who were sometimes days away. The relief force that assembled to break the siege represented the largest coordinated human military action in prehistoric history. Over 300 fighters from 17 different settlements converged on the battle site, bringing with them weapons and tactics that had been refined through months of intertribal cooperation. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was humanity's declaration that they would not be driven to extinction by any predator, no matter how powerful. The battle itself was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare that wouldn't be equaled for thousands of years. While one force engaged the Titanoboa blockade directly, another team worked to restore water flow to the besieged settlement. Scout units provided real-time intelligence about serpent positions and movements. Specialized hunter-killer teams targeted individual snakes that attempted to break away from the main engagement. The Titanoboas fought with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. These ancient predators seemed to understand that this battle represented more than just another territorial dispute. The outcome would determine which species would dominate the swamplands for generations to come. Their coordinated attacks demonstrated intelligence and planning capabilities that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about reptilian behavior. When the first water began flowing back into the settlement, a cheer went up from the defenders that could be heard for miles. But the celebration was premature. The Titanoboas had one final surprise that would test human resolve like nothing before. As the relief forces pressed their advantage, believing victory was within reach, The serpents revealed the true scope of their intelligence. They had been holding reserves in locations that human scouts had never discovered. Massive Titanoboas that had remained hidden throughout the siege suddenly emerged from underground channels and concealed positions. The humans found themselves surrounded by enemies that seemed to materialize from the very ground beneath their feet. What followed was perhaps the most desperate fighting in human history. Surrounded on all sides by crush them with casual creatures that could ease, the combined human forces faced annihilation. Traditional tactics became useless when the enemy could attack from any direction simultaneously. Individual heroism, while admirable, was insufficient against opponents that coordinated their movements with mechanical precision. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Among the relief forces was a group of humans who had been studying Titanoboa behavior for months, trying to understand how these creatures communicated and coordinated their attacks. They had noticed patterns in the serpent's movements, subtle signals that seemed to direct group behavior. During the height of the battle, these observers made a crucial discovery. The Titanoboas were using specific sound frequencies to coordinate their attacks, vibrations that traveled through the ground and water to convey tactical information. More importantly, they identified which individual serpent was serving as the command coordinator for the entire group. The decision to target the command serpent was controversial and dangerous. It required a specialized assault team to break through the defensive perimeter and engage the largest, most dangerous Titanoboa in direct combat, while the rest of the human forces were already stretched to their limits. The margin for error was essentially zero, and failure would result in the complete annihilation of the human alliance. 20 volunteers stepped forward for what everyone understood was likely a suicide mission. These weren't the strongest fighters or the most experienced hunters. They were individuals who understood that sometimes survival requires sacrificing personal safety for the greater good of the species. Their names would be remembered in human oral traditions for thousands of years. The assault on the command serpent was unlike anything that had been attempted before. While the main human forces created diversions to draw attention away from the target, the specialist team moved through areas of the battlefield that seemed impossible to navigate. They crawled through spaces barely wide enough for human bodies, swam through channels filled with murky water and hidden dangers, and climbed over obstacles that would have challenged modern military units. When they finally reached their target, the command Titanoboa was positioned in what could only be described as a natural fortress. Surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided protection from multiple angles, with clear sightlines to direct the battle and escape routes that led directly to deep water. It was a position that any military commander would envy. The attack had to be perfect. One coordinated strike that would neutralize the target before it could signal for assistance or retreat to safety. The assault team had trained for this moment, practicing their coordination until they could move as a single organism. Each member knew exactly what role they would play, what signals to watch for, and what to do if the plan went wrong. The signal came at dawn, when the morning mist provided just enough concealment to mask their final approach. 20 humans armed with the most advanced weapons their technology could produce launched themselves at a creature that outweighed them collectively by several tons. The attack was so sudden and overwhelming that the massive serpent had no time to react defensively. What happened next changed the entire dynamic of the battle. With their command structure disrupted, the coordinated Titanoboa assault began to falter. Individual serpents, no longer receiving tactical guidance, reverted to their natural hunting behaviors. Instead of working together as a unified force, they began operating as separate predators, pursuing their own objectives. The humans, meanwhile, maintained their coordination and discipline. Years of alliance building and joint training had created fighting units that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions without losing cohesion. As the serpent formation collapsed, human forces pressed their advantage with precision strikes that exploited every gap in enemy defenses. The tide of battle turned dramatically. Titanoboas that had seemed invincible when working together became vulnerable when isolated from their support network. Human tactics that had been ineffective against coordinated serpent attacks proved devastatingly successful against individual targets. By midday, the remaining Titanoboas were in full retreat toward the deeper waters of the swampland. But the humans had learned from previous encounters. They didn't simply celebrate victory and return to their settlements. They pursued their enemies with the same systematic approach that had won them the battle. The pursuit phase of the conflict revealed just how much both species had evolved during their extended war. The Titanoboas employed rearguard tactics, with some individuals sacrificing themselves to slow human pursuit while others escaped to fight another day. The humans, meanwhile, demonstrated strategic patience, refusing to be drawn into ambushes or overextend their supply lines. This wasn't just about winning a single battle anymore. Both sides understood that they were engaged in a conflict that would determine the future evolutionary path of their respective species. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and neither side was willing to accept anything less than total victory. The war had transformed both combatants in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Humans had developed military organization, advanced weapon technology, and tactical thinking that represented millions of years of compressed evolution. The Titanoboas had demonstrated intelligence, coordination, and adaptability that challenged every assumption about reptilian cognition. But perhaps most importantly, both species had learned to see their conflict not as random violence, but as a struggle for survival that required long-term strategic thinking. The age of simple predator-prey relationships was over. What emerged from the swamplands would be something entirely new in evolutionary history. The next phase of their war would take them into territories that neither species had explored before, both geographically and evolutionarily. The lessons learned in blood and mud would shape the development of intelligence, cooperation, and warfare for millions of years to come. And this was only the beginning. The aftermath of the Battle of Three Rivers sent shock waves through the prehistoric world that would reshape the very fabric of survival itself. What happened next wasn't just another chapter in an ongoing conflict. It was the moment when two species crossed a threshold that would forever alter the course of evolution on our planet. Picture this scene unfolding across the ancient swamplands. Word of the human victory spread faster than wildfire through communication networks that had never existed before in natural history. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. The news wasn't just traveling between human settlements. The Titanoboas had developed their own information networks, and they were sharing tactical intelligence across distances that seemed impossible for creatures without modern technology. Within days of the battle, something unprecedented began happening throughout the region. Human settlements that had never made contact with each other suddenly found themselves receiving detailed reports about Titanoboa movements, attack patterns, and defensive weaknesses. Meanwhile, serpent populations that had been scattered across hundreds of square miles began converging in ways that defied everything scientists understand about territorial behavior. But here's where this gets absolutely mind-blowing. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals that both species were doing something that shouldn't have been possible given their evolutionary stage. They were learning from each other's tactics and adapting them for their own use. Humans began moving through water with serpentine efficiency, while Titanoboas started using pack-hunting techniques that resembled human military formations. The intelligent arms race that followed makes modern technological development look slow by comparison. Human tool-making sites from this era show innovation cycles that typically take thousands of years compressed into just months. Stone weapons became composite tools. Simple traps evolved into complex mechanical devices. Most remarkably, humans began creating weapons specifically designed to exploit Titanoboa anatomy in ways that suggest they had conducted detailed studies of their enemy's physiology. The serpents weren't sitting idle during this innovation explosion. Fossil evidence reveals physiological changes that occurred far too rapidly to be explained by normal evolutionary processes. Titanoboas from this period show enhanced sensory organs, modified scale patterns that provided better camouflage, and most disturbing of all, brain structures that suggest dramatically increased intelligence. Something was driving both species toward evolutionary leaps that should have taken millions of years. The pressure of constant warfare was creating a feedback loop where each advancement by one side forced corresponding developments in the other. What emerged from this biological arms race would be unlike anything the planet had ever seen. The first evidence of this mutual evolution appeared during what historians call the Silent Season. For nearly 3 months after the Battle of Three Rivers, neither side launched major offensive operations. Human scouts reported seeing Titanoboas in the distance, but no attacks occurred. Serpent watchers noted unusual movement patterns, but no direct confrontations. Both species seemed to be preparing for something bigger. During this period of apparent calm, extraordinary developments were taking place on both sides. Human settlements began implementing innovations that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of ancient civilizations thousands of years later. Permanent fortifications replaced temporary camps. Specialized roles emerged within communities, with individuals focusing on weapon making, tactical planning, or intelligence gathering rather than general survival tasks. The social structures that developed during this time represented a quantum leap in human organization. Leadership hierarchies based on military effectiveness rather than age or strength. Communication systems that could coordinate complex operations across vast distances. Most remarkably, the first recorded evidence of human writing systems developed specifically to document Titanoboa behavior and tactical information. Meanwhile, the serpent communities were undergoing their own revolutionary changes. Titanoboas began exhibiting behaviors that challenged every assumption about reptilian social structure. They formed permanent alliances that transcended traditional territorial boundaries. They developed specialized roles within their groups, with some individuals serving as scouts, others as heavy assault specialists, and still others as what could only be described as tactical commanders. The breakthrough that ended the silent season came from an unexpected source. Human observers had noticed that Titanoboa behavior seemed to follow predictable patterns during certain environmental conditions. Temperature changes, water levels, even atmospheric pressure appeared to influence serpent activity in ways that could be anticipated and exploited. But when humans tried to use this information to their advantage, they discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about their enemies. The Titanoboas had been deliberately creating false patterns, feeding misleading information to human observers while concealing their true capabilities and intentions. The realization that they were facing enemies capable of deliberate deception sent shock waves through human leadership councils. This wasn't just about fighting large, dangerous animals anymore. They were engaged in psychological warfare with opponents that could think several moves ahead and deliberately manipulate information to gain tactical advantages. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Human intelligence operations became exponentially more sophisticated overnight. Doubled false information to SERP agents were deployed to fee-ent observers. Decoy operations were launched to mask real military preparations. Counterintelligence protocols were developed to detect and neutralize enemy deception efforts. The Titanoboas, meanwhile, escalated their own psychological operations to levels that bordered on the supernatural. They began using environmental manipulation not just for tactical advantage, but to create fear and confusion among human populations. Water sources would be contaminated in ways that seemed random, but followed patterns designed to maximize psychological impact. Sounds would be generated during the night that mimicked human voices, drawing defenders away from their posts into carefully prepared ambush sites. The war was evolving beyond physical confrontation into something that resembled modern information warfare. Both sides were fighting for control not just of territory, but of their enemies' perceptions and decision-making processes. The stakes had escalated beyond survival to encompass the very nature of consciousness itself. When active hostilities resumed, the level of sophistication on both sides was shocking. The first engagement of what became known as the Mind War took place near a human settlement. that had been carefully fortified using lessons learned from previous battles. Multiple defensive perimeters, overlapping fields of fire, escape routes, and supply caches had been positioned to create what military theorists would later recognize as a perfect defensive position. The Titanoboa assault began with what appeared to be a straightforward frontal attack. Dozens of massive serpents emerged from the swampland and began advancing toward the human fortifications and formations that looked suspiciously similar to military tactics humans had used in previous battles. The defenders, confident in their preparations, began implementing their carefully rehearsed defensive protocols. It was a trap within a trap within a trap. The frontal assault was a feint designed to draw human forces into predetermined positions. While the defenders focused on the obvious threat, specialized Titanoboa units were moving through underground channels that human intelligence had never detected. But the serpents had anticipated that humans would eventually discover the underground approach. So they had prepared a third level of deception that would activate once their tunneling operations were exposed. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Multiple layers of strategy and counter-strategy played out simultaneously as both sides attempted to outmaneuver opponents that seemed to anticipate every move. Human commanders found themselves fighting battles on levels they hadn't known existed, while Titanoboa tactical coordinators adapted to human innovations in real time. What made this engagement particularly significant wasn't just the complexity of the tactics involved, but the realization that both species had developed capabilities that transcended their original evolutionary programming. Humans were displaying predictive abilities that seemed almost supernatural, while Titanoboas were demonstrating abstract reasoning skills that rivaled human intelligence. The turning point came when a human tactical observer made a discovery that changed everything. During the height of the battle, while analyzing Titanoboa movement patterns, she noticed something that initially seemed impossible. The serpents weren't just coordinating their attacks through sound and vibration. They were using mathematical principles to optimize their formations and timing. The implications were staggering. Mathematical thinking was supposed to be uniquely human, a cognitive ability that separated our species from all other life forms. Yet here was evidence that Titanoboas had independently developed similar capabilities and were using them for military purposes with devastating effectiveness. The human response to this discovery was swift and decisive. If their enemies could use mathematical principles for tactical advantage, then humans would have to develop superior mathematical applications to maintain competitive parity. What followed was an explosion of human intellectual development that compressed millions of years of cognitive evolution into just weeks of intense warfare. Geometric principles were applied to fortress design, creating defensive structures that maximized protective coverage while minimizing resource requirements. Predictive mathematics were used to anticipate Titanoboa movement patterns with unprecedented accuracy. Most remarkably, humans began using abstract mathematical concepts to develop weapons and tactics that exploited previously unknown vulnerabilities in serpent behavior. The Titanoboas, meanwhile, were implementing their own intellectual escalation. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed what could only be described as engineering capabilities, constructing elaborate trap systems that required advanced understanding of physics and material science. They began using tool manipulation techniques that demonstrated problem-solving abilities comparable to human innovation. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the serpents started exhibiting what appeared to be cultural transmission of knowledge. Tactical innovations developed by one Titanoboa group would appear in other populations across vast distances and time intervals that suggested organized teaching and learning processes. The war was no longer just about territorial control or species survival. It had become a contest between different forms of intelligence, different approaches to understanding and manipulating the physical world. The outcome would determine not just which species dominated the swamplands, but which type of consciousness would shape the future evolution of life on Earth. As the conflict intensified, both sides began pushing the boundaries of what should have been biologically possible. Humans developed sensory enhancement techniques that allowed them to detect Titanoboa presence through environmental changes too subtle for normal perception. Serpents exhibited coordination abilities that suggested some form of collective consciousness operating across individual organisms. The evolutionary pressure was creating changes that occurred faster than genetic modification should allow. Both species were adapting not just physically, but mentally and socially in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the pace of evolutionary development. Something about the intensity of their conflict was accelerating natural selection beyond all known parameters. Environmental evidence from this period reveals landscape modifications that could only have resulted from deliberate collaboration between highly intelligent organisms. Entire river systems were redirected, forest compositions were altered, and geological formations were modified in ways that served the strategic objectives of both human and serpent populations. The swamplands themselves were becoming a battlefield that reflected the intelligence and capabilities of its combatants. Every feature of the landscape was being optimized for warfare by opponents that understood terrain manipulation at levels that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern military engineering. But the most remarkable development was the emergence of what could only be described as meta-strategic thinking. Both sides began planning not just for immediate tactical situations, but for long-term evolutionary outcomes. Humans started making decisions based on how their actions would affect the species thousands of years in the future. Titanoboas began exhibiting behaviors that suggested they were planning for scenarios that might not occur for multiple generations. The war had transcended individual survival or even species competition. It had become a struggle between different visions of what life on Earth should become. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and neither side showed any intention of backing down. What happened next would determine whether intelligence would be defined by human creativity and cooperation, or by serpentine efficiency and predatory perfection. The battle for the future of consciousness itself was about to reach its most critical phase, and both species were preparing for a confrontation that would echo through evolutionary history for millions of years to come. The evolutionary arms race had reached a tipping point that neither species could have anticipated. What emerged from the swamplands during this period wasn't just tactical innovation or biological adaptation. It was the birth of something entirely new in the history of life on Earth. Both humans and Titanoboas were developing capabilities that transcended their original evolutionary blueprints, creating forms of intelligence that had never existed before. The first signs of this transformation appeared in what researchers now call the convergence event. Human settlements across the region began reporting identical innovations appearing simultaneously in communities that had no direct contact with each other. Advanced trap designs, sophisticated communication protocols, and weapon technologies were emerging independently in locations separated by hundreds of miles. But here's what makes this absolutely incredible. The Titanoboas were experiencing the same phenomenon. Serpent populations that had been isolated from each other for generations suddenly began exhibiting identical behavioral patterns and tactical innovations. It was as if both species had tapped into some form of collective intelligence that operated beyond individual consciousness. The implication sent shock waves through both human and serpent leadership structures. If innovations were spreading without direct communication, then the traditional advantages of information control had become obsolete overnight. Tactical secrets that had taken months to develop were becoming universally available to both sides almost instantaneously. Military commanders on both sides faced a strategic nightmare. How do you maintain operational security when your enemies seem to know your plans before you've finished making them? How do you develop tactical advantages when any innovation immediately becomes available to your opponents? The answer came from an unexpected source. Instead of trying to prevent information sharing, both species began accelerating it deliberately. Human settlements started broadcasting their innovations openly, reasoning that if their enemies would learn the information anyway, they might as well gain the advantage of coordinated implementation. The Titanoboas adopted similar strategies, sharing tactical developments across their entire population network. What followed was an explosion of innovation that compressed millions of years of technological development into just months of intense collaboration. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The accelerated innovation wasn't just benefiting individual species. It was creating hybrid solutions that combined human creativity with serpentine efficiency in ways that neither side could have achieved alone. The first hybrid innovation appeared during what became known as the Great Convergence. Human observers studying Titanoboa movement patterns discovered that the serpents had developed mathematical models for optimizing energy expenditure during extended operations. When humans adapted these models for their own use, they found they could maintain combat effectiveness for periods that had previously been impossible. Meanwhile, Titanoboas began incorporating human tactical principles into their own operations. The rigid hierarchical structures that had characterized serpent society gave way to flexible command networks that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions with unprecedented speed. The results were devastating for both sides and remarkably effective. The psychological impact of these developments was profound. Human warriors found themselves using techniques that felt fundamentally serpentine, moving through water with fluid grace that seemed to bypass their mammalian limitations. Titanoboas began exhibiting behaviors that resembled human problem-solving, approaching challenges with analytical thinking rather than pure instinct. Both species were becoming something new, something that transcended their original evolutionary programming. The war wasn't just changing tactics and technology. It was reshaping the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The first major engagement featuring these hybrid capabilities took place at the Battle of the Floating Gardens. A massive human settlement had been established on artificial islands constructed in the deepest part of the swampland. The location was chosen specifically because it combined the defensive advantages of water barriers with the agricultural potential of rich swamp soil. The Titanoboas had been studying this settlement for weeks, analyzing its defensive capabilities and identifying potential vulnerabilities. But their approach to the assault demonstrated thinking patterns that would have been impossible for serpents just months earlier. Instead of relying on overwhelming force or stealth attacks, they developed a strategy that required abstract reasoning and long-term planning. The attack began with environmental manipulation on a scale that dwarfed previous operations. Entire sections of the swampland were systematically altered to create channels that would funnel water flow in predetermined directions. Temperature gradients were modified through careful positioning of organic materials that would decompose at specific rates. Most remarkably, the serpents began using controlled fires to create atmospheric conditions that would affect human sensory capabilities. The human defenders, meanwhile, were implementing defensive strategies that incorporated serpentine movement principles. Instead of maintaining fixed positions, they began flowing between defensive points like water finding its path through obstacles. Their formations became fluid and adaptive, capable of reorganizing instantaneously in response to changing tactical situations. The battle itself was unlike anything that had occurred in the previous phases of the war. Both sides moved with intelligence that seemed to anticipate not just immediate tactical developments, but second and third-order consequences of every action. Individual combats became chess matches where each move was calculated to create advantages several steps into the future. What made this engagement particularly significant was the emergence of what could only be described as battlefield communication between the species. During the height of combat, human and Titanoboa tactical coordinators began exchanging information through methods that transcended traditional communication barriers. It wasn't cooperation exactly, but rather a form of competitive collaboration where both sides shared intelligence to create more challenging and sophisticated conflicts. The results were spectacular and terrifying. Combat effectiveness on both sides reached levels that seemed to violate physical laws. Humans moved with speed and precision that approached serpentine capabilities, while Titanoboas demonstrated strategic thinking that rivaled human tactical planning. The battlefield became a laboratory where both species pushed the boundaries of what intelligence could accomplish. But the most remarkable development occurred during a lull in the fighting, when something unprecedented happened. A group of human warriors and a cluster of Titanoboas found themselves trapped together in a collapsed section of the artificial island. Instead of immediately attacking each other, both groups began working together to escape their predicament. The collaboration lasted only minutes, but its impact would resonate through both species for generations. Humans and serpents combined their unique capabilities to solve engineering problems that neither could have addressed alone. Human tool manipulation, combined with Titanoboa's strength and flexibility, created solutions that transcended the limitations of individual species. When they finally escaped their temporary prison, the brief alliance ended immediately, and combat resumed. But something fundamental had changed. Both sides had experienced firsthand the potential of interspecies cooperation, and that knowledge would influence every subsequent engagement. The psychological impact of this incident spread through both populations like wildfire. Human councils began debating whether their enemies were truly enemies or simply competitors for the same evolutionary niche. Titanoboa social structures started incorporating concepts that resembled human ethical frameworks, weighing the costs and benefits of continued warfare against potential alternatives. The war itself began evolving from a simple contest for territorial dominance into something far more complex. Both species were developing philosophical frameworks that questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying their conflict. Was victory worth the costs of continued escalation? Could two intelligent species coexist in the same environment? What were the long-term consequences of their evolutionary arms race? These questions became more pressing as both sides developed capabilities that made traditional warfare increasingly destructive. Weapons and tactics had evolved to the point where single engagements could devastate entire populations. The margin for error had shrunk to essentially zero, and both species faced the possibility of mutual annihilation if the conflict continued to escalate. The turning point came during what historians call the Night of Revelations. Human scouts monitoring Titanoboa populations detected massive movement patterns that suggested preparation for the largest assault in the history of their conflict. Every serpent in the region appeared to be converging on human settlements simultaneously, creating the potential for a final battle that would determine the survival of both species. Human leadership councils faced an impossible decision. They could attempt to match the serpent escalation, mobilizing every available warrior for a last desperate defense. Or they could try something that had never been attempted in the history of warfare between intelligent species. They could attempt to communicate with their enemies not as predators and prey, but as equals engaged in a conflict that threatened both of their futures. The decision to attempt interspecies diplomacy was controversial and dangerous. Many human leaders argued that it was impossible to negotiate with creatures that had spent months trying to exterminate them. Others pointed out that continued escalation would likely result in the extinction of both species, making any alternative worth exploring. The diplomatic initiative began with a series of carefully planned signals designed to convey peaceful intentions without creating vulnerability to attack. Human settlements began broadcasting specific sound patterns that had been observed in Titanoboa communication networks. Weapons were positioned in defensive configurations that demonstrated readiness without appearing overtly threatening. Most importantly, human negotiators began approaching serpent positions under circumstances that clearly indicated non-hostile intent. The initial response from the Titanoboa populations was mixed and confusing. Some groups maintained their aggressive postures, continuing preparations for large-scale assault operations. Others began exhibiting behaviors that seemed to mirror human peaceful signals. Most remarkably, several serpent communities initiated their own communication attempts, using methods that suggested they had been developing similar diplomatic concepts independently. What followed was the most extraordinary negotiation in the history of intelligent life on Earth. Two species that had evolved completely different communication systems, social structures, and cognitive frameworks began the painstaking process of establishing common ground for peaceful coexistence. The breakthrough came when both sides realized they had developed remarkably similar conclusions about the long-term consequences of their conflict. Human strategic planners had calculated that continued escalation would likely result in environmental destruction that would make the swamplands uninhabitable for both species. Titanoboa tactical coordinators had reached identical conclusions using entirely different analytical methods. The recognition that both species faced the same existential threat created the foundation for unprecedented cooperation. Instead of fighting each other for control of a territory that might become worthless, they could work together to ensure its continued viability for both populations. The first joint operations between humans and Titanoboas focused on environmental restoration projects that benefited both species. Humans provided tool manipulation capabilities and abstract planning skills, while serpents contributed raw strength and intimate knowledge of aquatic ecosystems. The results exceeded anything either species could have achieved alone. But the most significant development wasn't the practical achievements of their cooperation. It was the emergence of hybrid thinking patterns that combined human creativity with serpentine efficiency in ways that created entirely new forms of problem-solving. Both species began developing cognitive capabilities that transcended their original evolutionary programming. The swamplands themselves began transforming under the influence of interspecies collaboration. Artificial waterways were constructed that optimized conditions for both human settlements and serpent habitats. Agricultural systems were developed that provided food sources for human populations, while creating environments that supported the prey species that Titanoboas required for survival. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals technological innovations that wouldn't be seen again until the development of advanced human civilizations thousands of years later. Hydraulic engineering projects that rivaled Roman aqueducts, agricultural techniques that anticipated modern permaculture principles. Most remarkably, what appeared to be early experiments in selective breeding programs designed to enhance the capabilities of both species. The transformation wasn't limited to technology and environmental management. Both species underwent psychological and social changes that represented quantum leaps in evolutionary development. Human communities developed social structures that incorporated serpentine efficiency principles, creating organizational systems that could coordinate complex operations with unprecedented speed and precision. Titanoboa populations, meanwhile, began exhibiting behaviors that resembled human cultural transmission. Knowledge and innovations were being passed between generations through teaching processes rather than purely genetic inheritance. Individual serpents began developing specialized skills and roles that went far beyond their original predatory programming. The hybrid civilization that emerged from their cooperation was unlike anything the planet had ever seen. It combined the best aspects of both species while transcending the limitations that had previously constrained their individual development. Human creativity, enhanced by serpentine precision, created solutions to problems that had seemed impossible just months earlier. But perhaps most importantly, both species had learned to see their conflict not as a zero-sum competition, but as a catalyst for mutual evolution. The war hadn't been won by either side. Instead, it had transformed both combatants into something greater than they could have become alone. The swamplands had become a laboratory for interspecies cooperation that would influence the development of intelligence and consciousness for millions of years to come. The lessons learned in blood and mud had created new possibilities for what life on Earth could become. And this was still only the beginning of their story. The hybrid civilization continued to evolve at a pace that defied every known law of biological and social development. Within just seasons of their first successful cooperation, humans and Titanoboas had created integrated communities that functioned with efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. But success brought new challenges that neither species had anticipated. As their hybrid society grew more sophisticated, it began attracting attention from other predators and competitors that viewed the unusual alliance as either a threat to be eliminated or an opportunity to be exploited. The first external threat came from the highlands, where populations of early primates had been watching the developments in the swamplands with growing concern. These distant cousins of humanity had their own territorial ambitions, and the sight of humans cooperating with their former enemies suggested possibilities and dangers that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, from the deeper waters beyond the swampland, ancient marine predators began investigating reports of coordinated activities that disrupted traditional hunting grounds and food chains. Creatures that had ruled the oceans for millions of years suddenly found their domains influenced by the actions of terrestrial species they had never considered significant. The hybrid civilization faced its first major test not from internal conflicts, but from external pressures that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The response would determine whether their cooperation was merely a temporary alliance of convenience or the foundation of something that could endure and expand beyond the boundaries of their original territory. The stage was set for conflicts that would dwarf even the epic battles between humans and Titanoboas. But now they would face these challenges not as enemies, but as allies whose combined capabilities had already proven capable of transcending the limitations of individual species evolution. The war in the swamplands had ended, but the real test of what they had become together was just beginning. The response from the highland primates came sooner than anyone expected. Scout reports began filtering back to the hybrid communities with disturbing news. Massive troop movements were occurring in the elevated territories, with early primate populations abandoning their traditional ranges and moving toward the swampland borders. But these weren't random migrations. The movement patterns showed clear evidence of strategic planning and coordination that rivaled the organizational capabilities humans had developed during their war with the Titanoboas. These highland cousins had been learning from the conflict below, adapting military innovations for their own purposes. The intelligence reports painted a picture that sent chills through both human and serpent leadership councils. The highland primates had developed weapon technologies that seemed specifically designed to counter the advantages of human Titanoboa cooperation. Projectile systems that could target serpents from distances that prevented retaliation. Trap networks that exploited the movement patterns both species used during their coordinated operations. What made the situation even more concerning was evidence that the highland forces weren't acting alone. Territorial markings and communication signals suggested they had formed alliances with other species that viewed the swampland hybrid civilization as an existential threat to the established order of predator relationships. The first probing attacks came during the season of low water when the natural defensive barriers of the swampland were at their weakest. Highland raiders struck at outlying settlements with hit-and-run tactics that demonstrated intimate knowledge of hybrid defensive strategies. They would appear suddenly, cause maximum disruption, and vanish before coordinated response forces could engage them effectively. But these weren't random raids. Each attack targeted specific aspects of human Titanoboa cooperation, attempting to drive wedges between the allied species by creating situations where their different capabilities became liabilities rather than advantages. Supply routes that required both human tool manipulation and serpent strength were systematically disrupted. Communication networks that relied on interspecies coordination were jammed with false signals. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Some human communities began questioning whether their alliance with the Titanoboas was worth the external threats it had created. Certain serpent populations started wondering if their cooperation with humans had made them vulnerable to enemies they could have handled alone. The hybrid civilization faced its first major internal crisis as external pressures began exposing fault lines that had been hidden during the euphoria of successful cooperation. Trust that had taken months to build began eroding under the stress of sustained enemy action designed specifically to exploit interspecies differences. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During one of the Highland raids, a joint human Titanoboa patrol managed to capture several enemy combatants alive. What they discovered during interrogation changed everything both species thought they knew about the scope of the threat they faced. The Highland primates weren't just organized. They had developed a sophisticated intelligence network that had been monitoring swampland activities since the earliest phases of the human Titanoboa War. They had detailed maps of hybrid settlements, comprehensive analyses of cooperative tactics, and most disturbing of all, strategic plans for systematic elimination of the alliance through targeted psychological warfare. But the captured documents revealed something even more significant. The Highland forces were part of a much larger coalition that included species from throughout the region. Marine predators from the deep waters, aerial hunters from the mountain peaks, and underground dwellers from the cave systems had all contributed intelligence and resources to what could only be described as a coordinated campaign to prevent the spread of interspecies cooperation. The implications were staggering. The hybrid civilization wasn't just facing territorial competitors. They were confronting organized opposition to the very concept of evolutionary cooperation between different species. Their success had threatened established hierarchies throughout the entire ecosystem, creating enemies they hadn't known existed. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Human strategic planners and Titanoboa tactical coordinators began developing defensive strategies that assumed simultaneous attacks from multiple directions by enemies with detailed knowledge of hybrid capabilities. But defense alone wouldn't be sufficient against opponents who viewed their very existence as an intolerable threat to natural order. And there you have it, the most incredible survival story that's been lost to time for 60 million years. From that first brutal encounter by the water's edge to the formation of the world's first interspecies alliance, we've witnessed something that challenges everything we thought we knew about evolution, intelligence, and the very nature of survival itself. These weren't just primitive creatures fighting for territory. These were the architects of consciousness, forging the blueprint for cooperation and warfare that would echo through millions of years of evolutionary history. The swamplands may have fallen silent,